Shalom and welcome to the weekend edition of the Daily Dose of Hebrew. We're looking today at Jeremiah chapter 7, verse 19. You may remember that we finished basically Jeremiah's temple sermon, and in the last couple verses, the Lord's been speaking to Jeremiah, telling him not to pray for this people because the Lord knows what they've been doing. Whole families have been involved with idolatry, the men and the women as well as the children, offering all sorts of offerings and sacred cakes to the Queen of Heaven and other forms of idolatry involved there. And with the result that the Lord had been provoked. They were provoking him, intentionally or not. That was certainly the result. Now the Lord's going to ask a very interesting question here. Let's go ahead and read it in Hebrew as we get started. Ha'oti hem mak isim ne'om Adonai. Halo otam lema'an boshet penihem. So we start with this word, a little bit unusual, but what we have at the beginning is a hey interrogative. Okay, it's usually taking this form. Actually, you're going to see this form down in the second part of the verse, right over here. So this is usual form in here because we have a guttural. We have just a full patak instead, so we don't have the shortened vowel here. And if you notice this, ot, this is our direct object marker with a first common suffix on it. So me. In the objective case here. And this is obviously front-loaded. We don't have a verb yet. So it's starting out with me, they, and we'll put this together once we go a little bit further. They, this is our third masculine plural pronoun, usually written hey ma with a comments hey at the end of it, hey ma. But we also find this form fairly frequently as well. Me, they, and this pronoun here is functioning as the subject, so to speak, of the participle here. Now, if we look at this, we see it's a masculine plural right here. We see this meme on the front with the patak, and then you see the hirik underneath. Good sign that we're going to have a hiphil participle, and that's indeed what we have. So we have a participle. It's going to be a masculine plural participle. Get that P down here. And this is a hiphil. From the verb ka'as. Now we just saw ka'as in the previous verse, in verse 18, which means to be angry in the cow, but in the hiphil means to vex, to provoke. And that's what's going on here. Me, they are provoking, because remember, this is a question here, declaration or an oracle of Yahweh. Is it not halo otam? Now there's another direct object marker, the et, with this time it's a 3mp suffix. Is it not they, or is it not them, or they themselves, we would say. This them is referring obviously to the same they that are doing the provoking over here. So in other words, me, are they really provoking? We could almost add that word really, because he's saying here, is it not they themselves, in order or so that, boshet panihem, shame, here's our word. This is not a participle. It looks a little bit like it, but it's actually a word which means shame. And here it's in construct form with panihem, their faces. Is it not they themselves, in order to, or so with result that there is shame of their faces. In other words, it's coming back upon them. They think they're doing something, and the result is that they're provoking God. And in a sense, they are provoking God. But in the reality of the whole situation, they're ending up hurting themselves. They're not just provoking themselves, but they're bringing all this hurt and shame. This sort of conduct is bringing their own standard down, and it's bringing shame upon them. So, very interesting question here that sin is not just hurting God, because it is provoking Him, but it's much more than that. So fairly simple in its analysis. Let's hide our work here and look at a couple of translations to see what different versions have done with this. Jewish Publication Society, the older version, 1917, of their Tanakh. Do they provoke me, saith the Lord? So pretty straightforward. So again, but the me is very front-loaded here. Me, do they really provoke? Because of the, I put the really in there because of the way it's placed at the beginning. Do they not provoke themselves? So the word provoke is not there repeated, but it's certainly understood in the context. Do they not provoke, harm, bring something terrible upon themselves to the confusion of their own faces? Confusion is another good word here, as long as we don't understand it simply in the intellectual sense. It's more of a moral sense as well. Shame is a good word for that. To the shame of their own faces, of their faces. And then in the Christian Standard Bible, more of a modern translation, and a little bit on the paraphrase side, but not too much. But are they really provoking me? So they add this word really, again, once again, picking up the fact that it's early in the sentence. Really provoking me? This is the Lord's declaration. Isn't it they themselves being provoked to disgrace? So I like that. You don't have provoked being repeated again in the text here, but the idea is repeated, and they themselves to disgrace, to the shame of their faces. That's a good way of explaining what this concept is all about. It's really hurting that they themselves. And one more in the Net Bible, which has developed this much more in the area toward a paraphrase here. But I am not really the one being troubled. Now that may be a little bit of an overstatement, because the Lord is certainly unhappy with people's response. This is a broken relationship. So he is being troubled, says the Lord. But rather, they are bringing trouble on themselves to their own shame. So it does bring the contrast rather clearly there. When we sin, it grieves the Lord, but it doesn't cause any harm to him in that sense, except in our relationship. And in the final analysis, we are only hurting ourselves, as the Lord is pointing out to Jeremiah the prophet here. Now, he's got more to say in the following couple verses, so check back with us as we keep working through Jeremiah chapter 7 in the weekend edition of the Daily Dose of Hebrew. Shalom.